Ethan Brooks sat in his lavish office staring out at the skyline of Tulsa, Oklahoma, his gaze lost in the reflection of the glass windows. The world seemed to belong to him, golden, glistening, and easily within reach. The clinking of the wine glass from his last meeting still echoed in his mind. He'd sealed another deal, increased his company's portfolio, and added another zero to his net worth. Another day of success, another day of feeling nothing. He had it all: money, power, influence. But as Ethan stared out at the city, there was an emptiness growing inside him. It was a feeling that gnawed at his conscience, a whisper that couldn't be drowned out by his achievements. He thought back to his last conversation with Tara. She'd looked at him with a mixture of concern and frustration, something he had not seen in years. She had mentioned his growing detachment, but he brushed it off, as he always did. Today, however, the feeling was unbearable. The phone on his desk buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. The voice on the other end was one he knew all too well. It was his lawyer, David. "Ethan, we need to talk. There's been an incident," David said, his voice tight with urgency. "What kind of incident?" Ethan's heart skipped a beat, the unease creeping back into his chest. "It's about the construction project in Oak Ridge. There's been a fatality," David said. The words hit Ethan like a punch to the gut. His mind raced, but his voice remained steady. "Fatality? How?" David hesitated before responding. "A worker fell from a scaffold, and it's being linked to negligence in safety measures. The site's been reported, and the media is already picking it up." A silence fell between them. Ethan's grip tightened around the edge of his desk. His mind flashed to the countless construction projects his company had overseen. The thousands of workers who had risked their lives building the towers he profited from. He had always been too far removed to think about the risks. The workers had been just faces in the crowd, invisible to him behind the luxury of his world. "How bad is it?" Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer. "The company's going to take a massive hit. The public is already outraged. People are demanding answers and—" David hesitated. "We're going to be under investigation." Ethan sat back, his chair creaking under the weight of his thoughts. The walls of his office seemed to close in on him. For the first time, the mask of success he had so carefully crafted felt flimsy, like it could crumble with the slightest touch. He didn't have to ask how it would affect his image. He could already feel the stares of judgment, the weight of a scandal brewing. He would lose more than just a few clients. This would tarnish his reputation. He would become a symbol of corporate greed, of a man who valued money over people. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair as he leaned forward. "What do we do?" Ethan's voice was barely above a whisper, as if the answer lay just beyond reach. David's voice came through again, a bit softer. "You need to face this head-on, Ethan. You need to show people you're willing to make things right. People won't care about your wealth if they see you as just another corporate villain." Ethan's mind began to race. There was a cold, calculated part of him that wanted to minimize the damage, to hide behind his lawyers and wait for the storm to pass. But deep down, he knew that would never be enough. This was a wake-up call he couldn't ignore. For the first time, the reality of his life, the people he had stepped over to get where he was, came crashing into his consciousness. "All right," he said, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. "I'll deal with it, but I need to understand the whole picture before I make a move." David agreed to arrange a meeting with the authorities, and Ethan hung up, staring at the glass again. But this time, it wasn't the reflection of success he saw. It was the face of a man who had built his empire on the backs of invisible workers, whose sacrifices he had ignored for far too long. Suddenly, the city didn't seem so golden. Ethan felt the weight of the world pressing down on him, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel invincible. He stood up, grabbed his coat, and walked toward the door. Today, everything was about to change. Ethan spent the rest of the day in a haze, the words of his lawyer echoing in his mind. Face it head on. He had always been someone who dealt with problems by throwing money at them, hiring the best people, making everything go away with a few well-placed phone calls. But this was different. He couldn't buy his way out of this mess. The guilt gnawed at him, suffocating him in a way nothing else had. That night, after an awkward dinner with Tara where neither of them said much, Ethan sat in his study. The glow of the desk lamp felt strangely isolating, like it cast a spotlight on him, exposing him in ways he couldn't hide from. He ran his hand over his face, his thoughts tangled with the weight of the decisions ahead. He could keep going the way he always had, burying his head in the sand, hoping the storm would pass. He could deny responsibility, let the lawyers and PR team clean up the mess, and move on with his life. But deep down, he knew that wouldn't work anymore. The shame would always linger, creeping in every time he looked in the mirror or walked into a meeting. The life he had built on the backs of others, treating workers like numbers and profits as the only measure of success, felt like it was crumbling beneath him. A sharp knock on the door snapped him out of his thoughts. Tara stood in the doorway, her face serious but soft with concern. "Ethan, can we talk?" He nodded, pushing away from the desk. Tara entered and sat down across from him, her eyes studying him with a mixture of love and frustration. It had been a long time since they had sat down and talked like this. The distance between them felt vast, but she wasn't about to give up on him, not without a fight. "You know, I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This whole situation, it's not just about your company. It's about you, who you've become." Ethan felt a pang of guilt, but he didn't flinch. "I know," he said quietly. Tara exhaled deeply, her eyes softening. "I get it, Ethan. You want to fix it. But it's not just about saving face or making a few changes. You can't fix everything with money or power. It's going to take more than that." Ethan ran his fingers through his hair, feeling the weight of her words. She was right. This wasn't just about business or reputation. It was about understanding the consequences of his actions, the lives affected by his decisions. "I'm not sure where to start," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Tara looked at him with a mix of sadness and hope. "You start by being honest with yourself, with the people who depend on you, and with me." The silence between them grew heavy. For a moment, Ethan wished there was a quick fix, a way to skip past this painful conversation. But there wasn't. The truth had already been laid bare, and now it was time to face it. "I'm going to do something," Ethan said, finally finding his voice. "Something that will make me face the consequences of what I've done. I need to understand what I've built, what I've ignored. I'm going to spend time with the workers, see firsthand what they go through." Tara looked at him, the skepticism in her eyes slowly giving way to cautious hope. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Ethan nodded. "I have to do this. For me, for them. I can't keep hiding behind the walls I've built." She stood up and moved toward him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I don't know what this will look like, but I'm here. I always will be. Just be sure you're ready for the truth." Ethan swallowed hard. The truth was something he hadn't been willing to face for a long time. But now, he had no choice. "I am," he said. "I'm ready." As Tara left the room, Ethan stood there for a long moment, staring at the darkened window. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was clear. The life he had known, the world he had carefully built, would never be the same. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or a bad thing. Ethan stood at the construction site, his hands trembling as he adjusted the hard hat on his head. It was an odd sensation, the weight of the helmet, the heaviness of the boots, and the sensation of dirt beneath his feet. For a moment, he felt like a child playing dress-up, but then the noise of the site, a chorus of drills, hammers, and shouted instructions, pulled him back into reality. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times. He had pictured himself seamlessly blending in with the crew, effortlessly lifting materials, holding his own against the men he had once seen as mere tools for his own gain. But now, as he stood there on the fringes of the action, reality set in. Carlos, the older worker who had been watching him closely, approached. "You ready, or just gonna stand there all day?" His voice was gruff, but there was a hint of curiosity behind it. Carlos had already noticed Ethan's hesitations, and Ethan knew there was no hiding behind his wealth today. "I'm ready," Ethan said, trying to sound confident. His voice cracked slightly, betraying him. He looked down at the task in front of him, lifting a heavy beam and carrying it to the other side of the site. "All right, follow my lead," Carlos instructed, pointing to a group of workers moving a stack of steel bars. "Don't think about it too much. Just keep moving." Ethan nodded and bent to pick up the beam. His muscles screamed in protest as he straightened up, but he kept his head down, focusing only on the task. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his breath came in quick, shallow gasps. It felt like hours before they finally reached the other side of the site, though in reality, it had only been a few minutes. The workers around him moved with ease, their bodies in sync with the demands of the job, while Ethan stumbled and struggled to keep up. Each movement felt foreign to him, like his body was betraying him, refusing to cooperate. "You all right, Brooks?" Carlos's voice snapped him out of his thoughts. "You're looking like you might pass out." There was no malice in his tone, just blunt observation. Ethan looked at him, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Yeah," he muttered. "I'm fine." Carlos raised an eyebrow. "You sure? You don't have to prove anything to anyone here." For a split second, Ethan felt his old defenses rising, an instinct to push back, to deny weakness, to show that he was more than just a suit and tie. But then, something in Carlos's steady gaze made him pause. Maybe it was the genuine concern in the man's eyes, or maybe it was the realization that no amount of wealth or status could change the fact that he was utterly out of his element here. "I'm fine," Ethan repeated, this time with more conviction. But as he straightened up, a sharp pain shot through his lower back, and his knees buckled. He caught himself on the edge of a concrete pillar, his breath coming in short bursts. Carlos chuckled softly. "Yeah, I thought so. You're gonna need to take it slower if you don't want to hurt yourself." Ethan winced, nodding. There was a lesson in that, a painful, humbling lesson that his body wasn't accustomed to the life he had chosen. The life of wealth and ease had come at the cost of his strength, his endurance, and now, his pride. As they moved to the next task, the reality of his situation started to sink in. This wasn't going to be a quick fix, a chance to play at being one of the workers. This was about endurance, not just of body, but of mind, of spirit. He could feel the weight of his past decisions bearing down on him. By lunchtime, his arms ached, his back throbbed, and his hands were blistered. The workers sat in a circle, eating their sandwiches and chatting like old friends. Ethan hesitated before sitting with them. He had always been used to eating alone, to avoiding the messiness of casual conversation with people who didn't share his world. Carlos slapped the ground beside him. "Come on, sit down, don't be shy." Ethan glanced at the others who were looking at him, some curiously, some with faint smiles. It was a simple invitation, but it was one that felt foreign, almost like a gesture of acceptance. Ethan sat down, his stomach tight with discomfort. He unwrapped his sandwich, suddenly aware of how alien this all felt. The workers spoke about their families, their lives outside the job, simple things, yet their words carried a weight that Ethan had never fully understood. There was a depth to them, a connection forged by shared hardship and sweat. One of the men, Mike, caught Ethan staring. "So, Brooks," he said, his voice rough but friendly, "what's it like to own all this?" He gestured vaguely to the half-built structure behind them. "To call the shots?" Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. He wanted to respond with something clever, something that would mask the vulnerability he felt, but all he could manage was, "It's not what it seems." Mike nodded knowingly. "Yeah, I get that. I've seen a lot of rich guys come and go. They think this works easy, think we just move rocks for a living. They don't see what it really takes." Ethan looked at him, feeling the weight of the man's words sink in. "I guess I'm just learning." The other workers nodded, acknowledging his honesty. It was a small moment, but for Ethan, it felt like a breakthrough. As the lunch break ended and the crew returned to work, Ethan felt a strange sense of determination. The day had been hard, brutal even, but it had also given him something he hadn't realized he needed: humility. For the first time, he was beginning to see the world through different eyes that weren't clouded by wealth or pride. And somehow, that realization felt like the beginning of something new. The next few days blurred together for Ethan. The physical exhaustion of the job continued to chip away at his pride, but it was the emotional weight that truly began to sink in. Each time he lifted a steel beam or shoveled dirt, he was reminded of how little he had ever truly known about the people who worked for him. The men and women on the site, covered in sweat and dirt, were no longer just faceless workers to him. They were living, breathing humans, each with their own stories. But nothing prepared him for what happened next. It was a hot afternoon when the site manager called a meeting to discuss safety protocols. Ethan had been working alongside Carlos, moving debris when the call came. He followed Carlos to the small office trailer where the others were gathered. The air inside was heavy with the smell of grease and sweat. Carlos sat at the table, his back straight, his expression unreadable. Ethan took a seat beside him, and the murmurs around them quieted as the manager, Paul, began speaking. "We've got an issue," Paul said, his voice low. "A worker's been seriously hurt. The scaffold collapsed earlier today. We're still getting the details, but it's bad. Real bad." The room fell silent. Ethan's heart began to race. He had been expecting something like this, but hearing it out loud made it hit harder than he anticipated. "Who?" Carlos asked, his voice cold but controlled. "Mike," Paul replied, glancing at Ethan before continuing. "He was one of our best, been with us for years, but this time it wasn't just a freak accident." The words hit Ethan like a punch. Mike? The same Mike who had sat beside him during lunch just days ago? The worker who had made him feel like an outsider, but in a way that was oddly comforting. Ethan's mind raced, his stomach knotting. How could this happen? Was the scaffolding faulty? Had they overlooked something? As if reading his thoughts, Carlos spoke again, his voice soft but sharp. "Mike's family is going to want answers," he said, "and they're going to want justice." Ethan's stomach sank even further. It wasn't just about a worker getting hurt. It was about the fact that his company's oversight, or lack thereof, was directly responsible. He had always known that some things were bound to break, some corners were bound to be cut. But hearing it now, in this room, with the faces of men who had to live with these decisions every day, made it real. Carlos turned his gaze toward Ethan, his eyes hard, unblinking. "You're gonna fix this, right? You're gonna make it right." Ethan opened his mouth but couldn't find the words. He wasn't sure what fixing this meant. Was it simply throwing money at the family and moving on? Was it about reforming policies and pretending that was enough? Or was it about doing something far deeper, something that might cost him more than he was willing to pay? He looked around the room, at the workers who had watched him struggle over the past days, and for the first time, Ethan felt a deep sense of guilt. Not just for Mike, but for all of them. They were risking their lives every day to build his empire, and all he had done in return was treat them like commodities. To him, they had always been just a means to an end, until now. "I'll take care of it," Ethan said quietly, his voice shaking slightly. He stood up, looking around the room at the workers who were waiting for him to do something, anything. He was their boss, their leader, but for the first time, Ethan felt completely inadequate. Carlos stood up beside him. "It's not just about the money. It's about what you're going to do when it's time to face the truth." Ethan didn't respond. He couldn't. His thoughts were scattered, his heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. All he could think about was Mike, and the realization that he wasn't just facing a business crisis. He was facing the consequences of years of neglect and ignorance. As the meeting ended, Ethan walked back to the site, his mind clouded with thoughts of what he had to do. He could no longer hide behind the mask of wealth and power. The truth was staring him in the face, and it was far uglier than he had ever imagined. He had built his fortune on the backs of men like Mike, but he hadn't built anything that could withstand the truth of what it cost. Now he would have to face it, or risk losing everything. Ethan stood at the edge of the construction site, his thoughts racing. The weight of the morning's revelation still sat heavily on his chest. Mike's injury was just the beginning. It wasn't just about the immediate consequences. It was about the damage that had been done over the years, the lives he had ignored while building his empire. His empire. the very thing that had distanced him from everything that truly mattered. Carlos had seen the shift in him, had witnessed the cracks forming. It had started as an irritation, the way Ethan was struggling to fit in. But now it was something deeper, something Ethan couldn't hide any longer. Carlos had always been a man of few words, but today, Ethan knew the confrontation was coming. There was no more avoiding it. Carlos approached him slowly, his face unreadable, his eyes focused on Ethan. The workers were scattered around, busy with their tasks, but Ethan could feel their gaze on him. He could feel the weight of their unspoken judgment. Carlos stopped in front of him, arms crossed. "You're not fooling anyone, Ethan," Carlos said, his voice calm but firm. "You think you can waltz in here, wear the same clothes as us, work a few days and everything's going to change? You think this is going to erase everything?" Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry. He'd been preparing for this moment, but now that it was here, the words escaped him. He had no excuse, no defense. All he could do was face Carlos, knowing that every mistake he'd made, every choice that had led him here, was hanging between them like a shadow. "I'm trying," Ethan finally said, his voice almost a whisper. "I'm trying to make things right." Carlos scoffed, shaking his head. "Make things right? You don't get to just make things right by pretending to be one of us. You think you can just buy your way out of this, don't you? Just like you've done with everything else in your life." Ethan flinched. The words cut deeper than he had expected. He wanted to explain himself, to tell Carlos that this wasn't just a publicity stunt or some shallow attempt at redemption. But the truth was, he wasn't sure what this was. He wasn't sure if it was enough. "I've seen guys like you before," Carlos continued, his voice rising now, his anger palpable. "You think the world owes you something. You take everything you can and leave the rest behind. And now that something's gone wrong, you think you can come down here and fix it? It doesn't work like that, Ethan. It doesn't work like that." Ethan's chest tightened. He had known Carlos was angry, but hearing the rawness in his voice was something different. It was a challenge that Ethan didn't know how to respond to. "I'm not here to fix everything," Ethan said quietly. "I'm here because I have to see it, see what I've built, see what it costs. I have to face the truth of what I've been ignoring. I can't keep running from it, from you, from them." He gestured toward the workers who had stopped to watch, their eyes fixed on the confrontation. Carlos took a step closer, his expression hardening. "You don't get it, do you?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "You've been running from it your whole life, hiding behind the title, the suits, the money. You never had to face the people you hurt, until now." The words hit Ethan harder than anything else had. The truth was inescapable, and it was standing right in front of him. "I know I failed them," Ethan said, the words coming out more easily now, his voice thick with emotion. "I know I failed you, but I need to do something about it. I can't undo what's been done, but I can try to make sure it doesn't keep happening." Carlos studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly. "You'll have to do more than that, Ethan. A few speeches, a couple of apologies. They won't make you a hero. You'll have to show them. You'll have to prove it." Ethan's heart sank. He knew Carlos was right. This was only the beginning. There would be no shortcuts, no quick fixes. He couldn't buy his way out of this. All he had now were his actions, and he had to show them, prove to them that he was willing to change. Not for the company, not for the press, but for the people who had given him everything without asking for anything in return. Carlos turned to walk away, but stopped just before he did. "Don't think you've got all the time in the world, Ethan. The longer you wait, the harder it's going to get." Ethan watched as Carlos disappeared into the crowd of workers, his words lingering in the air. The confrontation had ended, but Ethan felt no relief. Instead, he felt something else, a sense of responsibility he hadn't known he could feel. The road ahead was long, and the weight of his past mistakes was heavy. But for the first time in years, Ethan knew that if he was going to survive this, if he was going to fix what was broken, it wouldn't be because of his wealth or influence. It would be because he learned to stand up, face the truth, and be accountable. And that was just the beginning. The weight of the conversation with Carlos lingered over Ethan like a dark cloud, pressing against his chest every waking moment. He couldn't shake the look in Carlos's eyes. The condemnation, the silent accusation. Every step Ethan took on the construction site felt like a reminder of everything he had neglected, of the lives he had overlooked. Mike's injury, the workers' lives hanging in the balance, his own company teetering on the brink of collapse, everything collided in his mind. By the time he returned home that evening, the guilt was overwhelming. Tara was sitting at the kitchen table, her face soft but tired. She looked up when he entered, her eyes searching his face as if trying to read him. "You look like you've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders," she said, her voice gentle but concerned. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he dropped his briefcase on the counter, his eyes flickering to the window as though the answers were out there somewhere. Tara watched him carefully, sensing the shift in him. "What's going on, Ethan? You've been different ever since everything happened. You're not talking to me. You're not talking to anyone." Ethan turned to face her, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. "I don't know how to fix this, Tara," he said, his voice strained. "I've messed up so much. I've been blind to everything, to the people around me. I only saw numbers, profits, things I could control. And now it's too late." Tara's gaze softened, but she didn't say anything. She stood up slowly, walking over to him. She reached for his hand, but Ethan pulled away, his own guilt making it hard to face her. "You've always been good at fixing things, Ethan, but some things don't have a quick fix," Tara said quietly. She paused, then added, "You have to face this. You have to feel what you've done. It's the only way you'll ever change." The words hit harder than he expected. For years, Ethan had masked his guilt behind success, behind the comforts of his wealth and power. But now, standing here with Tara, it was clear that there were no more distractions, no more running. "I saw it today," he muttered, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw it with my own eyes. How far I've gone, how little I've actually done to protect the people who've made me who I am. I've been so caught up in my own life that I didn't realize how much damage I've caused." His voice faltered. Tara's hand was on his arm now, a small but firm touch. "You're facing it now, Ethan. You're not running anymore." Ethan turned away from her, his eyes closing as he fought to hold back the tears. He had always prided himself on being in control, on being the one who called the shots. But now, faced with the truth of the harm he had caused, that control felt like an illusion. His wealth and power meant nothing in the face of this. The workers were not just numbers. They were real people, people who trusted him and had been failed by him. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Ethan lay in bed, his mind racing. He thought about the workers, their tired faces, their quiet strength. Carlos's words rang in his ears. "You've been running from it your whole life." Ethan knew it was true. Every time he made a decision, he had avoided the real consequences, only seeing the surface. Now the consequences were impossible to ignore. In the quiet darkness of the night, he made a decision. He couldn't fix everything overnight. He couldn't erase the past. But he could start by facing the truth, by confronting the people he had wronged, and by showing them that he was ready to change. He didn't know what that would look like yet, but he knew it started with accepting responsibility. Fully. No more excuses. The next morning, Ethan drove to the site early, before anyone else had arrived. As he stood there looking at the men and women moving around him, the weight of his decisions was heavier than ever. It wasn't just about making amends anymore. It was about proving to them that he could be a leader who deserved their respect, not because of his wealth, but because of his integrity. Carlos appeared just as the crew began setting up for the day, his eyes scanning the site before landing on Ethan. He said nothing, just nodded once. The unspoken challenge was clear. Show me you're not just here to play the part. Show me you're here to make a real difference. Ethan didn't respond, but he knew the only way to prove himself was through action. He walked toward the crew, his shoulders straight, his heart heavy. Today, he wasn't just Ethan Brooks, the millionaire businessman. He was someone who needed to earn the right to call himself a leader. Ethan sat in his office, staring at the phone in his hand. He had tried to avoid making the call for days, but now it was unavoidable. Tara hadn't spoken to him much since their conversation last week. She had been distant, her expression softening only when they spoke about the workers or their marriage. But behind her eyes, he could see the cracks. He could feel the growing distance. The guilt weighed heavily on him. He wasn't sure how to fix what he had done, how to make amends for the years of neglect and disconnection. He could feel it in every silence, in every time Tara had glanced away instead of holding his gaze. The phone call had to happen. He knew it. He dialed her number, his heart racing as the line rang. When she picked up, the voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. "Ethan," Tara said softly, her voice steady but lacking warmth. "What's going on?" I think we need to talk," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "About us." There was a pause. Tara didn't answer immediately. He could hear her breathing, slow and deliberate, before she spoke again. "I think you're right. It's been a while since we really talked, hasn't it?" Ethan swallowed hard. "I know I've been distant, Tara. I know I've been avoiding things. But everything that's been happening, it's made me realize how much I've taken you for granted." Tara's voice softened just a little. "You've been distant for a long time, Ethan. I've really tried to be there for you. But you've been so wrapped up in your work, in the company, in trying to fix things that you forgot about us, about me." The words cut deeper than Ethan expected. He had known it, of course. He had felt the strain, the unspoken tension, but hearing it from her directly made it real in a way he hadn't anticipated. "I'm sorry," he said, the words feeling inadequate but the only ones he had. "I've been so focused on everything else that I lost sight of what matters. I lost sight of you." There was a long silence. Ethan could almost hear her thoughts, the weight of the decision she was about to make. Tara had always been patient with him, but even patience had its limits. "I don't know what to do with all of this, Ethan," Tara finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to believe that you can change, that we can fix things, but you've hurt me. You've hurt us for so long." Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the sting of her words. He had hurt her. There was no denying it. All his wealth, his power, his influence, none of it had mattered if it had meant pushing her away, making her feel like an afterthought. The business, the success, it had all come at the cost of his marriage, his connection to her. "I know," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been selfish. I've been blind, but I'm trying to fix it, Tara. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose us." There was a soft sigh on the other end of the line. "I don't know, Ethan. I really don't know." Tara's voice cracked slightly. "I've spent so many years putting up with your work, with your need for control. But this is different. It's not just about the business, it's about me. It's about us." Ethan felt a lump form in his throat. The truth of her words hit him like a wave, and for the first time in years, he realized how much he had taken her presence for granted. He had treated her like an afterthought, someone who would always be there, someone he didn't have to fight for. "You don't have to decide right now," he said quickly, trying to hold on to what little hope he had. "I know I've made mistakes. I know I've let you down, but I want to work on it. I want to show you I can change." There was another pause. Tara's silence felt like a weight, pressing down on Ethan's chest. Finally, she spoke again, her voice still soft, but with a hint of resolve. "I don't know what the future holds, Ethan, but I can't keep living like this. You have to prove to me, to us, that you're willing to put in the work, not just for your company, but for me." "I will," Ethan said, his voice steady now. "I promise, I'll do whatever it takes." Tara's voice softened, though there was a note of caution. "We'll see, but I need you to understand that I can't keep waiting for you to change. I need you here. I need you present, not just in body, but in spirit, in everything." "I hear you, Tara," Ethan replied, his voice raw with emotion. "And I will be here, I promise." The call ended quietly, leaving Ethan standing alone, his heart heavy with the realization of how much he had lost and how much work lay ahead. But it also gave him something else, a purpose. The road ahead was long, and it would take more than promises to heal the wounds he had caused. But at least now he was ready to try. The meeting with the workers that afternoon was nothing like Ethan had imagined. His original plan had been simple: show up, apologize, and try to start mending what was broken. But as he stood in front of the crew, the words felt like they were trapped in his throat. The guilt, the shame, it all pressed against him like a physical weight. Carlos stood beside him, his gaze sharp, his arms crossed. The other workers, who had once seemed so distant, now felt like an overwhelming presence, all waiting for Ethan to speak. They had given him their trust once, and he had betrayed it. Ethan cleared his throat, his heart pounding. "I know I've failed you all," he began, the words feeling too small for the enormity of the situation. "I've spent my life ignoring the people who made my success possible. You, each of you, have worked harder than I ever gave you credit for, and I've let you down." He looked around the group, seeing the mixture of skepticism, anger, and strangely some pity. The workers weren't angry in the way he had expected. They were resigned. Their faces showed disappointment, but also a weariness that spoke volumes. "I've been blind to what's important," he continued. "To you, your families, and the lives you've risked for this company. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. But I want to make it right. I want to do the work, not just for the company, but for you, for all of you." A long silence followed. No one moved. Carlos's gaze remained fixed on Ethan, his eyes unreadable. Finally, one of the younger workers, Daniel, spoke up. "And what exactly do you think you can do to fix this?" His voice was quiet but cutting. "You think a speech is going to make us forget all the times you've treated us like we're disposable? That we're just here to make you richer?" Ethan's chest tightened, and for a moment he thought he might crumble under the weight of Daniel's words, but he forced himself to stand tall. "No, a speech isn't enough, but it's a start. I want to understand the work you do here, what you go through every day, and what you need to be treated with respect. I'll do whatever it takes." Carlos stepped forward, his voice firm but not unkind. "Words are easy, actions are harder, so show us. Don't tell us." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You need to prove you're here for the right reasons, not for your image, not for your reputation, but for the people who put in the work." Ethan nodded slowly, the weight of Carlos's words sinking in. He had been living in a world of empty gestures for so long, convincing himself that money and status were the answers to everything. Now he knew better, but actions would speak louder than any apology. "I'll do the work," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I'll prove it to you, to all of you. I'll show you that I'm not just here to clean up my mess, I'm here to change, and I'll start today." The workers remained quiet for a moment, exchanging glances. Ethan could see that their skepticism wasn't easily shaken. It wasn't enough to say the right things. He had to prove himself through every action, every decision. This wasn't just about his redemption. It was about rebuilding their trust, something that couldn't be fixed overnight. Carlos gave a small nod. "We'll see, Ethan. We'll see." As the crew dispersed and returned to their tasks, Ethan felt an overwhelming sense of both relief and dread. Relief because the first step was taken. He had said the words. He had opened the door to change. But dread, because now the real work began. It wasn't going to be easy. There were no shortcuts, no quick fixes. Ethan had to prove to himself, to the workers, and to Tara that he was capable of change, and it was going to take everything he had. The road ahead felt impossibly long, but for the first time in his life, Ethan was ready to walk it. The sun was barely up when Ethan walked onto the construction site that morning. The air was thick with the smell of fresh concrete and dust, the hum of machinery filling the space. But for Ethan, there was a quiet calm, a sense of purpose that had eluded him for so long. After the confrontation, after all the apologies and promises, something had shifted in him. He wasn't pretending anymore. He wasn't hiding behind his wealth, his position, or his past. He had made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but he was determined to face them head on. Carlos was there, just as he had been every morning, directing the crew, moving from task to task with ease. Ethan watched him for a moment, the quiet respect between them still hanging in the air. There was no applause, No grand gesture, just the quiet acknowledgement that things were changing, that maybe, just maybe, Ethan was ready to change too. "Morning, Brooks," Carlos said, without turning around, as if it were the most natural thing in the world for them to speak to each other now. Ethan smiled, though it was small and tentative. "Morning, Carlos." He joined the crew without hesitation, rolling up his sleeves and getting to work. The manual labor had become familiar, almost comforting in its simplicity. He didn't have to think too hard about what to do. He just did it, one task after another. Each movement felt purposeful, a contrast to the corporate world he had once controlled with a few keystrokes on a keyboard or a call to his lawyer. As the morning wore on, Ethan felt the exhaustion in his muscles, a dull ache in his arms, his back, his legs. But it was a good kind of pain, the kind that reminded him he was alive, that he was doing something real. At lunch, as the crew sat together on the ground, passing around sandwiches and talking about their families, Ethan felt the warmth of belonging, of inclusion. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't an outsider. He wasn't the boss or the millionaire. He was just one of them. "How's the back?" Mike asked, looking up from his sandwich. Mike was the one who had been injured recently, and though he was still recovering, he was back at the site, working light duties. There was a wry smile on his face, but it was tempered with something else. Something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but maybe something close to it. Ethan winced slightly, thinking of the day he had tried to lift the heavy beam, only to stumble and nearly collapse. "It's getting better. Slowly," he said, the truth of it hanging in the air. "But it's nothing compared to what you've been through." Mike laughed, a sound that was more a grunt than anything else. "You've got a long way to go before you catch up with us," he said, but there was a glint in his eye, a recognition. "But you're getting there." That was all Ethan needed to hear, not the words of the other workers, not the praise or the sympathy, just that quiet acknowledgement that, even in his struggle, he was becoming part of something bigger than himself. Carlos walked over, wiping his forehead with a rag. "You did good today," he said, his tone neutral, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Ethan nodded, though he didn't feel like he had done anything extraordinary. "It's just work," he said. "Real work." Carlos studied him for a moment, then gave a short nod. "Yeah, well, you're starting to get it. It's not about how much you know. It's about how much you're willing to give. And today you gave something." Ethan felt a warmth spread through him. It wasn't praise. It wasn't a stamp of approval. But it was enough. Enough to make him believe that maybe, just maybe, he could rebuild not just his reputation, but his life. As the crew got back to work, Ethan stayed behind for a moment, looking at the men and women around him. They were tired, worn, but they moved with a purpose that Ethan had never truly understood until now. He had been a man who thought power and money were the only things that mattered. But now, standing here, watching the workers carry on with their day, he knew that the true measure of a person wasn't in what they owned or how much they controlled. It was in how they lived, how they treated others, how they gave their best every single day, without asking for anything in return. Ethan wasn't the man he used to be, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure he wanted to be. But he had hope now, real hope, a hope rooted in action, in sweat, in effort. A hope that maybe, just maybe, he could find redemption, not by running from his past, but by facing it head on, with the strength and courage of the workers who had never given up on him. He straightened his back, wiped the sweat from his brow, and walked back into the fray, ready to show them and himself that he was not done yet. The heat of the day was stifling, and the air was thick with the smell of fresh concrete and sweat. Ethan stood at the edge of the construction site, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been working alongside the crew for weeks now, trying to prove himself, trying to earn their respect. But today, he was facing something bigger than himself, something he wasn't sure he was ready for. The company was in trouble. Financial pressure from investors had reached a boiling point. The new project, one that had been planned for months, was now teetering on the edge of collapse. Delays, Cost overruns and safety concerns had put everything at risk. And now it was up to Ethan to decide whether to cut corners to save the project or stand firm on his principles and risk everything. Carlos approached him quietly, his gaze steady, but there was a tension in his eyes. "You've got a choice to make," he said, his voice low. "The investors want results, and they want them now. They're pressuring you to speed things up, to cut back on safety measures and costs. You know what they want." Ethan felt the weight of Carlos's words, but more than that, he felt the weight of his own conscience. The choice seemed simple enough. Cut costs, finish the project faster, and keep the investors happy. But that wasn't the man he wanted to be anymore. Not after everything he had learned. Not after everything he had seen. "I won't do it," Ethan said, his voice firm. "I won't compromise on safety. Not again. Not for anyone." Carlos nodded, a silent understanding passing between them. "Good," he said, his tone more approving than Ethan expected. "But don't think it's going to be easy. The pressure's only going to get worse. You'll have to stand your ground, no matter what." As the day wore on, the pressure only intensified. The investors called, demanding answers, threatening to pull their funding if Ethan didn't deliver. Every decision felt like a test, and every misstep seemed to carry the weight of the world. The crew could sense the tension, too. They had seen what happened when things were rushed, when corners were cut. They weren't blind to the danger, and they weren't willing to risk their lives for a paycheck. By the end of the day, the weight of the choice hung heavy on Ethan's shoulders. He knew he couldn't turn back. He had to make the right decision, not just for the project, but for the people who depended on him. He had spent too many years chasing success, thinking that money and power would solve everything. But now, standing in the middle of the site, watching the workers go about their tasks with quiet dedication, he realized something. This was what mattered. Not the approval of investors, not the accolades, but the lives and well-being of the people who had been there all along. As the crew gathered to pack up for the day, Carlos came over to Ethan, his expression serious. "You did the right thing," he said, his voice low. "But don't think it's over. You're not out of the woods yet." Ethan nodded, his eyes scanning the workers around him. They were all tired, worn, but they were still here. They hadn't given up, and neither would he. "Thanks, Carlos," Ethan said, his voice quiet but full of conviction. "I'll make sure this project is done the right way. No shortcuts." Carlos gave a slight smile, the first real one Ethan had seen in weeks. "You'll earn their respect, but you've got to earn your own first." Ethan looked at the crew, their faces a mix of exhaustion and determination. He wasn't the man he used to be. He was learning, slowly but surely, what it meant to be a true leader. It wasn't about making the tough decisions for the wrong reasons. It was about doing the right thing, even when the stakes were high. As he walked away, he knew that the real test had only just begun. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He was ready. The days following Ethan's decision to stand his ground were a blur of sleepless nights and difficult choices. But as the weeks passed, something began to shift. The workers, once skeptical and wary, began to notice the change in him. It wasn't just in the way he handled himself on the site, but in his willingness to listen, to make sure they had what they needed to do their jobs safely and efficiently. Ethan was there with them now, not just in body, but in spirit. He wasn't just the boss. He was a part of the crew. Every day he showed up on time, rolled up his sleeves, and worked alongside them, not as a figurehead, but as a leader. The more time he spent on the ground, the more he realized the true cost of his past decisions, the lives he had disregarded in favor of profits. But with every day that passed, he also realized that there was hope for redemption. It wasn't easy. The pressure from the investors continued to mount, and the project still faced delays. But this time, the crew stood behind him. They were ready to give their all, because for the first time, they believed in him. And that belief wasn't born from empty words or promises, but from his actions, the way he treated them as equals, not tools for his success. One afternoon, as Ethan surveyed the progress of the site, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. There was a sense of unity among the workers, a bond that hadn't existed when he first arrived. They were laughing, talking, working together with a sense of pride that had been missing. Carlos walked up beside him, his gaze following the workers. "You're starting to earn their respect," he said quietly. Ethan nodded but didn't speak for a moment. He was still adjusting to this new version of himself. The man who had once thought success was measured in numbers now knew that real success was measured in trust, in the lives you impacted, in the relationships you built. "I'm trying," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I know I've got a long way to go." Carlos gave a small, approving nod. "That's the difference. You're trying. That's more than most ever do." Ethan looked around at the crew. The workers weren't just building a structure. They were building something greater. They were building trust, loyalty, and something Ethan had never fully understood: community. He had once thought leadership was about control, about telling others what to do. But now he understood that true leadership was about service. It was about lifting others up, not pushing them down. In the weeks that followed, Ethan continued to fight for what he knew was right. He stood firm on his decisions, pushing back against the investors when they pressured him to cut corners. And when the project finally reached its completion, it wasn't just the success of the building that mattered. It was the success of the people who had built it together. The grand opening day arrived, and there was a quiet sense of triumph in the air. The building stood tall, but it was the workers who stood taller in Ethan's eyes. As he walked through the site, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He had done it, not alone, but with the people who had once been invisible to him. That evening, as the crew gathered for a small celebration, Tara arrived. Ethan hadn't seen her all week. She had been busy with her own projects, and he knew the strain on their relationship was still there. But as she walked toward him, he saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen in a long time: hope. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. Ethan smiled, feeling a weight lift from his chest. "I'm just getting started." Tara reached out, taking his hand in hers. "I know," she replied, her voice steady. "But I can see the change. I can see you're doing the work. For the first time, I believe you." It wasn't much, but it was everything. As they stood there, surrounded by the workers who had now become his team, his family, Ethan realized that this was only the beginning. The road ahead would be filled with challenges, but for the first time, he wasn't facing them alone. This new legacy, his new legacy, wasn't built on wealth or status. It was built on trust, on respect, and on the understanding that true leadership wasn't about being at the top. It was about lifting others up. And as the sun set behind the building, Ethan stood tall, not because of his wealth, but because of the people who had helped him rebuild what he had broken. Ethan stood in the middle of the site, watching the workers move with practiced ease. The construction had finally wrapped up, and the building towered above him, a testament not only to the labor of his crew, but to the transformation he had undergone over the past months. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the steel and concrete, he felt a quiet pride settle in his chest. It wasn't just the building that had changed. He had changed too. The arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by humility and a deep respect for those around him. The lessons had been hard, but they had shaped him into someone he could stand to be. For the first time, Ethan felt like he wasn't just living for himself. Carlos approached him, wiping his hands on his pants. The crew was finishing their last few tasks for the day, preparing for the official opening tomorrow. "You did it," Carlos said, his voice low but with a note of approval that Ethan hadn't heard before. Ethan glanced at the building, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. "We did it," he corrected, turning to face Carlos. "I couldn't have done any of this without you or the team. I've learned more here in the last few months than I ever did in that office." Carlos smirked slightly, the hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I can tell. You're not the same man you were when you first walked in here." Ethan paused, absorbing the weight of Carlos's words. He wasn't the same man. He had seen the rawness of people's lives, the strength in their everyday struggles. He had learned that leadership wasn't just about calling the shots, but about supporting and being supported in return. It was about standing together, even when things seemed impossible. It wasn't just the building, Ethan said quietly. It was everything that came with it, the lessons, the growth, the people. The real success isn't in the structure, but in what we've built together. Carlos nodded. That's the truth. You're starting to see it. For a long moment they stood there, the weight of the past months settling over them. Ethan didn't need to say anything more. He knew now that this was just the beginning. The challenges wouldn't stop, but the man he had become had the strength to face them. As Carlos moved off to check on the crew, Ethan walked to the edge of the site, his eyes scanning the horizon. He thought about Tara, about the long road they had ahead. Their relationship was still healing, but for the first time, he felt like he had something real to offer her. A man who understood what it meant to give, to sacrifice, to grow. Tara had been patient with him, but the road to rebuilding their relationship would take time. He knew that. The conversations, the apologies, the actions, these would be ongoing. But he was ready. He wasn't the same man who had brushed her concerns aside, who had put everything but her first. He was a man who understood that the love and respect they shared would take more than promises. It would take daily commitment. He checked his phone, seeing a message from her. "Are you coming home soon?" He smiled to himself, the message simple but filled with hope. He was finally ready to go home. As Ethan walked through the gates of the site, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about finishing a project. It was about starting something new. It wasn't about winning back what he had lost. It was about creating something worth having in the first place. The full circle he had come was not just in his career, but in his life. The man who had once thought success was measured by wealth now knew that it was about the lives he touched and the integrity he built along the way. With every step, Ethan felt the weight of the past lift just a little bit more, replaced by the anticipation of what was to come. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of the future. He was ready for it. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting soft shadows on the office floor. Ethan stood by the window, looking out at the skyline. It had been months since he'd made the decision to change, to face the consequences of his past mistakes. But today the weight felt different. It felt like a new beginning. The company was moving forward. The workers were more than just employees now. They were partners in a new vision. Ethan had learned that true success wasn't just about numbers, profits, or expansion. It was about the people who helped you get there, the relationships built on trust and respect. And for the first time, he was starting to see the fruits of that belief. The phone on his desk buzzed, breaking the silence. Tara's name flashed on the screen. He smiled, his heart lifting. Their relationship had taken time to heal, but he could feel the connection growing stronger with every passing day. "Hey," he answered, his voice soft, a tinge of warmth that hadn't been there before. "Hey, Ethan," Tara's voice came through, steady and calm. "I was just thinking, we should talk about everything, about the future. I know we've been busy, but I feel like we're finally on the same page. You're really changing." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. He could hear the sincerity in her voice, but more than that, there was hope. Hope for them, for their future. "I know," he said quietly. "I know I've got a long way to go, but I'm ready for whatever comes next. I want to make it work. I want us to have something real." There was a brief pause on the other end. Tara had always been the one to hold them together, even when he hadn't realized how much he had pulled away. But now, she was starting to believe again, and that meant everything to him. "I'm ready too, Ethan," she said finally. "It's not going to be easy, but I can see how much you've changed. I want to give us a chance to build something new, together." Ethan felt his chest tighten with emotion. It wasn't just about their marriage. It was about everything. The people he had hurt, the trust he had broken, the years spent chasing success at the expense of his own happiness. He had wasted so much time, but now he was ready to make it count. "Thank you," he whispered, the words barely audible, "for giving me the chance." The conversation ended with a promise, but more than that, it was a moment of realization. The life he had built, his business, his wealth, his success, had all been empty without the people who mattered. The change had been slow, painful, but it had been worth it. Tara was the beginning of his new legacy, and he was determined to build on it. Later that afternoon, Ethan stood in front of the workers, the same crew who had once doubted him, who had once seen him as nothing more than a corporate figurehead. Now he was one of them, not in status, but in purpose. They had taught him more than he could ever repay. "Today marks a new chapter for this company," Ethan began, his voice steady but full of emotion. "But it's not just about the business, it's about all of you, your hard work, your loyalty, and your trust. I'm here to prove that the legacy we build won't just be about profits, it will be about the people who make it all possible." There was a murmur of agreement from the crew, but Ethan could see something else in their eyes. Respect. Not for the man he used to be, but for the man he was becoming. Carlos stepped forward, his gaze sharp, but his expression softening slightly. "You've come a long way, Brooks. But it's not just talk anymore. We've got work to do." Ethan nodded, his resolve firm. "And I'm here for it. We're all in this together now." As the crew dispersed to continue their work, Ethan stayed behind, watching them go. He felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. He was no longer chasing something external: wealth, power, status. Now he was focused on building something that would last: trust, respect, and a commitment to doing the right thing. The phone buzzed again, and this time it was a text from Tara. "I believe in us." Ethan smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached his eyes. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he was ready to face it. Not as a businessman, but as a man who had learned what it meant to truly live, to love, and to lead. And with that, he knew his legacy was just beginning. What do you think of Ethan's actions? Do you think he truly redeemed himself, or is there more to his journey? Share your thoughts in the comments below. On a scale from 0 to 10, what's your score for this story? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. And for more heartwarming tales, click here on the end screen to keep exploring.